In a bustling cafe, a wealthy widowed businessman watches a baker use sign language with his mute daughter, making her smile for the first time in years since her mother's death. The gesture catches him completely off guard, and what he does next will give you something to think about. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. Atlanta lay under a thin veil of autumn haze that morning, the kind that dulled the skyline into muted blues and grays. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his high-rise apartment, Ethan Miller could see the city's slow stirrings, the early commuters inching through traffic, the soft curl of steam rising from sidewalk coffee carts, the faint hum of a city waking up. Yet none of it reached him. He sat at the edge of his leather sofa, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the glass, as if the world outside had been sealed away behind an invisible wall. He was 38, a man who had built an education technology empire from scratch, the kind of man who once spoke on conference stages about innovation, leadership, and the future. But now his voice felt like a stranger to him, used only when absolutely necessary, worn thin from months of saying the wrong things, or worse, saying nothing at all. The silence in the apartment was not peaceful. It was the thick, airless kind that pressed against the skin, where even the smallest sound, a creak in the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, felt like an intrusion. Near the window, sprawled across a pale gray rug, Sophie sat with her legs folded to one side, her tiny shoulders hunched forward. Her tangled blonde hair caught in the morning light, a dull gold that looked almost weightless. She clutched an old rag doll against her chest, her fingers wrapped so tightly around its frayed dress that the fabric bunched under her knuckles. Her eyes, a pale, unblinking blue, were fixed on something beyond the glass, though Ethan doubted she truly saw anything. Sophie hadn't spoken a single word in over a year and a half, not since the fire. The memory came to him in flashes he couldn't control, the acrid smoke, the sirens splitting the night, the crushing disbelief when the fire chief told him there was nothing they could do for Claire. His wife had died that night. Sophie had been pulled out in time, coughing and crying, into a paramedic's arms. But from the moment she saw her mother's body covered in that cold white sheet, she'd fallen silent, as if the fire had burned away her voice along with everything else. Ethan had spent the first months in a frenzy of appointments: pediatric therapists, child psychologists, speech pathologists, specialists in Boston and San Francisco. He'd sat in waiting rooms smelling faintly of antiseptic and paper, clutching intake forms filled with questions about his daughter's emotional triggers and behavioral patterns. He'd written checks that would have paid for someone else's college tuition just to hear another professional say they could help, but nothing changed. Sophie remained silent, her world shrinking a little more each day. She no longer met people's eyes, she no longer played with other children. Even the sound of her own name seemed to pass over her without landing. The teachers had been kind, patient, but their reports were the same. Sophie did not participate, did not respond, did not engage. And then there was the line from her homeroom teacher last spring, spoken with a gentle, almost apologetic tone: "Maybe Sophie doesn't need more therapy, maybe she needs a reason to communicate again." He had nodded, pretending to understand, but the truth was it felt like a riddle he didn't know how to solve. What reason could possibly be strong enough to pull her back into the world? The morning sunlight shifted, casting long rectangles across the rug where Sophie sat. The doll in her arms was missing an eye. The thread that held its head to its body had loosened to a dangerous degree. Ethan noticed, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't sure if his words would reach her, and even if they did, he didn't know if they would matter. He stood slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, the tendons stiff from another night of shallow, fractured sleep. In the kitchen, the coffee maker clicked and gurgled to life. The smell of dark roast filled the air, rich but doing nothing to ease the knot in his chest. He glanced toward Sophie again. She had shifted slightly, adjusting the doll in her lap, her gaze never leaving the window. Her small profile, sharp little chin, delicate nose, was so still that for a moment she looked like a porcelain figurine. He wanted to go to her, to kneel down and find some way to bridge the impossible gap between them. But how? How do you talk to someone who has locked themselves so completely inside? His phone vibrated on the coffee table, a small burst of sound in the thick air. He didn't move to answer it. The world of meetings, contracts and shareholders felt 100 miles away from this living room where his daughter sat with a silence he could neither fix nor understand. He realized he was holding his breath, and when he exhaled, it came out in a slow, heavy sigh. There had been a time when mornings were full of music, Claire humming at the stove, Sophie's laughter spilling through the hall, the three of them squeezed together on this very rug reading books or building towers out of blocks. Now the rug felt like the shoreline of an ocean he couldn't cross. He lowered himself back onto the sofa, the leather sighing under his weight. Outside, the city moved on without them, the streets filling with people who had somewhere to be, someone to talk to. Inside, Ethan watched Sophie's small frame bathed in muted light, wondering how long a person could live like this before they disappeared entirely. He didn't notice that his hands were clenched until the muscles in his forearms ached. All he knew was that something had to change. He just didn't know what, or how. The following Monday morning carried the same pale autumn light as the week before, but for Ethan Miller it felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted movement. He had woken before dawn, unable to sleep past the restless turning of thoughts that had no answers. Sophie, his Sophie, was already awake when he stepped into the living room, her small frame perched on the same rug by the window, her doll clutched tightly against her chest. She didn't look at him when he spoke softly, suggesting they go out for a bit. She simply shifted her weight slightly, her eyes still on some invisible point beyond the glass. He took that tiny movement as agreement. It was more than he had gotten most mornings. By the time they reached the elevator, Sophie's doll was cradled in her lap, her fingers tracing the frayed hem of its dress. In the car, she sat in the back seat, her head turned toward the blur of passing buildings. He caught her reflection in the rearview mirror now and then, her expression unchanged, unreadable. He remembered the words of her teacher, a reason to communicate, and wondered for the 100th time what that could possibly be. Maple and Brew Café sat on a quiet corner in the heart of downtown Atlanta, its brick facade softened by ivy and weathered wood. The place had always been a favorite among artists, freelancers, and young professionals looking for a warm atmosphere away from the noise of the main streets. Ethan had chosen it not for its charm but for convenience. His business partner was already there, waiting with notes and figures to review. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, a small bell above it chimed, and the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around him like a blanket he couldn't quite feel. He held the door for Sophie, who stepped inside slowly, almost cautiously, as if the room might notice her. She stayed close to him, her free hand brushing his sleeve while she scanned the tables without meeting anyone's eyes. The cafe was alive with a gentle hum, the low murmur of conversation, the faint hiss of milk steaming behind the counter, the tap of laptop keys. He led Sophie to a table near the far wall where sunlight streamed in through tall windows, casting patterns across the polished wood. His partner was already there, standing to greet him with a firm handshake and a quick smile that faltered when he noticed Sophie's reserved stance. "Hi Sophie," he said kindly, but she only hugged the doll tighter and slid into her chair without a word. Ethan settled across from her, pulling out his notebook as his partner began running through updates on the project numbers, timelines, potential investors. He nodded where appropriate, his pen moving automatically, but his mind wandered, as it often did, back to Sophie. She sat across from him, her knees drawn up slightly, eyes fixed on the small plate in front of her. The doll's head rested on the table's edge like a silent companion. From the open doorway to the kitchen, a woman emerged carrying a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. She was in her mid-20s, tall and graceful, her skin a deep warm brown that seemed to glow against the cream apron tied neatly around her waist. Strands of hair escaped from the knot at the back of her head, brushing her cheek as she moved. Her name tag read Isabella. She smiled easily as she passed a table of regulars, setting down plates of pastries with a practiced rhythm. It was a smile that seemed to warm not just her face but the space around her. As she stepped toward the counter, her eyes caught on a boy seated near the front. He was maybe 9 or 10, his small hands moving in quick, deliberate shapes. Without hesitation, Isabella shifted the tray to her other hand and began to respond, her fingers fluid and expressive, her gestures carrying a kind of grace that felt both practiced and personal. Ethan noticed the boy's face light up, his shoulders relaxing as he engaged with her in the silent conversation. Across the table, Sophie's head tilted ever so slightly, her gaze, which had been dull moments ago, was fixed now on Isabella's moving hands. Ethan followed her line of sight, and felt a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, or hope so fragile he barely recognized it. Sophie's grip on her doll loosened just enough for one small finger to tap absent-mindedly against its worn fabric. Isabella finished speaking to the boy, her expression warm and animated, then glanced around the room. Her eyes landed on Sophie, and for a heartbeat she simply observed her, not with the polite curiosity of a stranger, but with a quiet attentiveness that seemed to reach across the space between them. Ethan noticed the subtle shift in her posture, the way her head inclined slightly, as if she understood something about Sophie that no one else in the room could. Setting her tray down on the counter, Isabella walked toward their table. She didn't approach hurriedly or cautiously, just naturally, as if this was the most obvious place for her to be. When she reached them, she crouched down so her eyes were level with Sophie's. She offered a smile that was soft but steady, one that asked for nothing in return. Then, without speaking, she lifted her hands and began to sign. The movements were gentle, deliberate, almost like a dance. Her eyes never left Sophie's, and though Ethan didn't know the meaning of the signs, he could feel their intention, an invitation, a bridge offered without pressure. Sophie froze, her lips parting slightly. For a long moment she simply watched, her eyes tracing the shapes Isabella's fingers made in the air. Then, to Ethan's astonishment, a hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. It was small, hesitant, but it was there, a smile he hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Isabella's expression softened further, and she repeated the signs more slowly, as if offering them like small delicate gifts. Sophie's hands shifted from the doll, rising tentatively into the air. Her movements were clumsy, uncertain, but she tried to mimic the shapes Isabella had made. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a rush of heat behind his eyes. It wasn't just the sight of Sophie moving her hands, it was the connection, the unspoken understanding that passed between her and this stranger. Isabella responded with a nod and a quick sign that seemed to say, "Yes, that's it." Sophie's smile deepened just a fraction, her gaze locked on Isabella as if the rest of the cafe had faded away. Ethan sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the fragile moment unfolding in front of him. His partner's voice had gone quiet, the meeting forgotten. Across from him, Sophie was communicating not with words, not with the voice she had lost, but with something that reached beyond sound. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he had nearly given up on, the sharp, unexpected edge of hope. That night, long after the city outside had gone quiet, Ethan found himself standing in the doorway of Sophie's room. The soft glow from her bedside lamp cast long shadows across the walls, catching on the faded pattern of her curtains. She sat cross-legged on her bed, the worn doll propped beside her, its button eye staring into the dim air. Her hands were moving, small tentative gestures, repeated over and over with a careful concentration that made Ethan hold his breath. They were the same signs Isabella had made in the cafe. Sophie's brow furrowed as she tried one movement again, her fingers curling a little awkwardly before she reset and tried once more. She didn't see him watching, and for once he didn't interrupt. He simply leaned against the frame, the weight in his chest shifting in a way he hadn't felt in years. It was subtle, but it was there, a sliver of something breaking through the thick walls she had built around herself. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, not from restlessness but from a need to move. Sophie was in the kitchen, her small frame perched on a stool, tapping the doll's hand against the countertop in a slow rhythm. He poured her a glass of juice, sliding it toward her. She took it without a word, but her eyes followed him a moment longer than usual. By mid-morning, he had made up his mind. Whatever had happened in that cafe yesterday, he needed to understand it, and he needed to thank the woman who had made it happen. The air was crisp as they stepped out of the car in front of Maple and Brew Cafe. Inside, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries greeted them. Isabella was behind the counter, sliding a tray of golden scones onto a display shelf. She looked up, her expression brightening in recognition. "You came back," she said, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity. Ethan returned her smile and stepped closer. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. Yesterday, what you did with Sophie, it mattered. More than you probably realize. Isabella glanced toward Sophie, who was standing just behind him, her doll clutched loosely at her side, her gaze flicking between them. Isabella's eyes softened. It was nothing, she replied, shaking her head. I just said hello in the way I know how. Ethan leaned on the counter slightly, lowering his voice. How do you know it so well? Her smile shifted, becoming something more reflective. I grew up with it, she said. Both my parents are deaf, my little brother too. Signing was my first language. I learned to speak later, but signing, it's part of who I am. Ethan listened, picturing a home where conversations happened in the air, where words were seen before they were heard. So you've been doing it your whole life, he said. Since before I can remember, she replied. It's how I tell stories, how I argue, how I say I love you. It's more than communication, it's connection. He hesitated, then asked, would you consider teaching Sophie, just a little? Whatever you did yesterday, she was practicing last night. It's the first time in years I've seen her want to learn something. Isabella's gaze lingered on Sophie, who had drifted toward the pastry case, her eyes scanning the rows of bread and cookies. I'm not a teacher, she said at last. I work here, I bake. I can show her a few things, but... She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Teaching is different. Before Ethan could respond, the cafe door opened and a burst of laughter swept in with the cold air. A small group entered, 3 children and 2 adults, all moving their hands in rapid fluid conversation. The boy from yesterday was among them. Isabella's face lit up as she waved, her fingers flying in greeting. The group responded with grins and animated signs, their hands painting invisible pictures in the air. Sophie had turned from the pastry case, her eyes locked on the scene. She watched the children, with an intensity Ethan recognized instantly, hunger, not for food, but for belonging. The children laughed silently, their joy clear in every movement. The adults signed with ease, their expressions shifting with each phrase. Isabella stepped forward, joining their conversation without missing a beat. It was a different kind of language, alive, expressive, unbound by sound. Sophie took a small step closer, then another, until she was standing at Ethan's side. He glanced down and saw it in her eyes, that spark again, faint but undeniable. And in that moment, he understood. The problem wasn't just that Sophie didn't speak, it was that she had no language, no bridge to connect her to others, no way to step outside the solitary island she'd been living on. And it wasn't only Sophie. He thought about the parents who must feel as helpless as he had, wanting to reach their children but unable to find the right key. He thought about the children who might go their whole lives without being given the chance to belong. Something settled in his chest then, solid and certain. He turned to Isabella, waiting until she stepped away from the group. I've been thinking, he said, his voice low but firm. What if we did more than just teach Sophie? What if we opened a class here, free for any child who needs it, and for parents too? A place where they can learn to talk to each other again. Isabella blinked, clearly taken aback. That's a big idea, she said slowly. Bigger than you probably realize. You'd have to plan it, fund it, organize. I can fund it, he cut in. I can organize it, I have the resources, what I don't have is the ability to teach it, but you do. She glanced toward Sophie again. The little girl was watching her with wide, unblinking eyes, her hands twitching as if she wanted to try something but didn't quite know how. Isabella's lips parted, then closed. She looked back at Ethan. I told you I'm not a teacher, she said quietly. You don't have to be, he replied. You just have to be willing. The rest we can figure out. For a moment the cafe seemed to still, the low conversations fading into the background hum of the espresso machine. Isabella's gaze moved between Ethan and Sophie, her expression caught between hesitation and something warmer, something that pulled at the corners of her mouth. Then she let out a slow breath. 1 hour a day, she said. After I finish here. No pressure. Ethan nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in months. No pressure, he agreed. But as Sophie took a tentative step toward Isabella, her doll swinging at her side, he knew there was more riding on this than either of them had admitted. Isabella crouched down, signing a simple greeting. Sophie raised her hands, fumbling through the shapes. Isabella smiled, correcting her gently, and Sophie tried again. Watching them, Ethan felt the shift as clearly as if the floor had moved beneath him. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about every child who had been left on an island, and every parent who wanted to build a bridge, and it was starting here, in this small cafe with a girl and a woman speaking in the quietest language he had ever heard. The first class began on a Saturday morning, when the light in Atlanta was still soft and gold, spilling through the tall windows of the small community room they had rented just 2 blocks from Maple and Brew Cafe. Ethan had arrived early with Sophie, carrying boxes of paper cups, bottled water, and a tray of muffins from the cafe. Sophie clung to her doll in one arm while helping him place chairs in a circle, her movements slow but deliberate, her eyes darting toward the door each time footsteps echoed in the hallway. The room itself had been transformed in a way that made it feel warm and inviting. Along the walls hung colorful drawings by local children, houses with crooked chimneys, suns with smiling faces, stick figures holding hands. One wall was covered with a large printed chart of the American Sign Language alphabet, each letter illustrated with a clear photograph of a hand forming the sign. On another wall, Isabella had pinned a series of laminated cards showing signs for simple words: hello, thank you, friend. The air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee from the cafe and the sharper, cleaner smell of freshly painted walls. At 10 o'clock, the first families arrived. A mother holding the hand of a little boy who hid behind her legs. A father guiding his teenage daughter into the room, her eyes scanning the space with cautious curiosity. A grandmother wheeling in a boy of about 12 who grinned at Sophie the moment their eyes met. Sophie's posture shifted, still shy, but there was something lighter in the way she stood, her fingers fidgeting against the fabric of her doll's dress. Isabella entered with a stack of flashcards in one arm and a smile that seemed to brighten the entire room. She moved with a calm assurance, greeting each family with a small wave and, whenever possible, a simple sign. When the chairs were full, she stepped into the center of the circle, her hands lifting as naturally as if she were breathing. She began with hello, demonstrating slowly, her movements deliberate and clear. Then she invited everyone to try. Sophie was among the first to raise her hands, her fingers forming the shape a little awkwardly but with visible determination. Isabella nodded to her, her eyes warm with encouragement. They moved on to thank you, please, good morning. The children giggled softly when they made mistakes, and the adults exchanged glances, realizing how much harder it was than it looked. But there was no embarrassment here, only patience, and the shared understanding that every movement was a step toward connection. Halfway through the class, Isabella knelt beside Sophie, showing her the sign for friend. Sophie repeated it carefully, then turned to the boy in the wheelchair and signed it to him. His smile was immediate and wide, and Sophie's lips curved in return, small but real. Ethan watched from the edge of the circle, his chest tightening at the sight. For months he had measured Sophie's days in silences, now he could measure them in signs learned, in glances exchanged, in moments of belonging. Toward the end of the hour, Isabella introduced a simple exercise. She called Sophie to the front, and signed, "Thank you," gesturing for Sophie to respond. Sophie lifted her small hands, forming the sign with deliberate care. The room was quiet enough to hear the faint rustle of sleeves as people shifted in their chairs. One of the parents, without thinking, lifted a phone and recorded the moment. Sophie's shy smile, Isabella's nod of approval, the soft ripple of applause in the form of raised twisting hands, the deaf community's silent clapping. The video made its way online before Ethan had even packed the chairs. By that evening, it had been shared hundreds of times, captioned with phrases like "hope in her hands" and "the power of connection." Local news outlets picked it up, and within days, Ethan's email inbox was filled with messages from parents asking how they could enroll their children. The following week, the class doubled in size. Volunteers from the cafe offered to bring snacks, a local print shop donated materials for more charts and flashcards. Even the city council reached out, offering the use of a larger venue if the program continued to grow. Yet with the attention came resistance. One gray Tuesday morning, Ethan sat in the glass-walled conference room of his company's headquarters, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. Around the table, several of his board members exchanged wary looks. "Ethan," one of them began. Her voice measured, "We're concerned about the amount of time you're devoting to this sign language project. It's admirable, but it's not part of our core business. Investors might see it as a distraction." Another chimed in, "We're on the verge of launching a new platform. If the media narrative shifts from innovation to your personal charity work, we risk diluting the brand. Ethan listened, fingers laced tightly together on the table. He could feel the old reflex rising, the instinct to calculate risk, to protect the company's image at all costs. But the memory of Sophie in that bright room, signing friend to a boy she had met minutes earlier, was stronger. "This isn't charity," he said finally, his voice steady but firm. "It's responsibility. We build educational tools for children. If we ignore the ones who can't access those tools because they don't have a language yet, what does that make us?" The room was silent for a moment. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. "We're not saying to abandon it," another board member said carefully, "but perhaps it could be scaled back, or, no." Ethan interrupted, "If anything it will expand. As of today, this program becomes part of our corporate social responsibility initiative. It will be funded, staffed, and supported just like any other project we run. If our investors can't see the value in that, then we'll find investors who can." The firmness in his tone left no room for debate. Back at the community room that Saturday, the class was busier than ever. New families filled the chairs, their faces a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Sophie sat near the front, her doll resting in her lap, her hands already moving in small, practiced shapes. Isabella caught Ethan's eye as she began the lesson, a quiet understanding passing between them. Outside, the world might have questioned the worth of what they were building, but inside this room, the value was undeniable. Every gesture, every shared smile, every moment of comprehension was proof. This was more than a class. It was the beginning of a bridge, one that would carry far beyond the four walls of the room where it had started. And Ethan knew, as he watched Sophie lean toward another child to show them how to form a sign, that no boardroom argument could outweigh what was happening here. Not now, not ever. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall front windows of Maple and Brew Cafe, casting warm bands of light across the familiar wooden floors. The air was rich with the scent of coffee and fresh pastries, but it carried something else today, an almost tangible sense of anticipation. Tables had been pushed back to make space for rows of folding chairs, and every one of them was filled. Parents, children, teachers, local reporters, and old regulars from the cafe leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on the small platform near the counter. A banner hung behind it, simple but clear, "Hands and Hearts, 1 year." Ethan stood off to the side, his arms folded loosely, feeling the steady hum of the crowd wash over him. It had been a year since that first hesitant class in the small community room down the street, a year since he had asked Isabella to take a chance on something neither of them could quite define. Now the program was in more than a dozen schools, with waiting lists in 3 more districts. He could see the fruits of it right here, children signing to each other across the room, parents smiling as they followed along, laughter moving silently in the air. Near the front of the platform, Sophie stood with her doll tucked neatly under one arm. She had grown taller in the past year, her hair a little longer, her eyes brighter. There was no trace of the girl who used to hide behind his legs in public spaces, clutching her toy as if it were the only lifeline in the world. Now she stepped up to the microphone with quiet assurance, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Isabella, who stood just a few feet away. Sophie lifted her hands and began to sign, each movement deliberate, graceful and clear. "Thank you," she signed first, then paused, her lips forming the words aloud so the room could hear them too. She spoke slowly, her voice soft but steady, every syllable shaped with care. She signed each phrase as she spoke, her eyes moving between the audience and Isabella, as if to make sure both worlds, hearing and silent, were included in her gratitude. "Thank you for giving me a language when I didn't have one. Thank you for helping me find my friends. Thank you for helping me talk to my dad again." Her fingers shaped the signs for friends and dad with perfect precision, and Ethan felt a tightening in his throat as the weight of her words landed. The audience was still for a moment, then every hand in the room rose and began to twist gently in the air, the silent applause of the deaf community. The motion rippled across the crowd like wind over a field, a wave of shared understanding and pride. Ethan's chest swelled as he looked at her, his daughter standing there without fear, her voice and her hands working in harmony. He caught Isabella's eye, and she gave him a small smile, her expression lit with the same pride that warmed his own. Sophie turned to her then, stepping down from the platform to stand beside her. The doll had slipped under her arm, forgotten in the moment. She reached for Isabella's hands and shaped the sign for family. Isabella returned it without hesitation, their fingers mirroring each other with perfect symmetry. They signed it again, slower this time, holding the final shape for a breath longer than needed, as if sealing the meaning in the space between them. Ethan stepped closer, watching them with a stillness that came not from restraint, but from the fullness of the moment. Around them, cameras clicked, conversations in both speech and sign began to rise again, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the oven in the back. But for him time had slowed to the pace of their hands. This was what it had all been for, not the headlines, not the expansion into new schools, not even the silent applause that had just filled the cafe. It was for this, his daughter standing with the woman who had taught her that silence could still be full of words, that connection didn't depend on sound. Sophie turned toward him then, signing the word family once more, this time including him in the motion. He raised his hands and returned the sign, feeling the simple truth of it settle into him like a final piece finding its place. Family here meant more than blood or names on a shared mailbox. It meant a circle where everyone could speak and be heard, no matter the language. It meant bridges built by patience, kindness, and the courage to reach across the quiet. And as the golden light deepened through the windows and the applause, silent and spoken, continued around them, Ethan knew this was not an ending at all, but the beginning of something that would keep growing, one hand, one word, one heart at a time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.